During a holiday trip, my husband and mother-in-law intentionally left me at the airport without a single penny to my name. I heard them laughing, saying, "Let's see if that stupid country girl can ever find her way home." After discovering their cruel plot, I didn't go back. Instead, 1 month later, I returned to make them pay for what they did. When they saw me, my husband and mother-in-law literally fainted in terror. Before we dive into the story, please let me know in the comments which state or country you're tuning in from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you even more thrilling stories. The sprawling expanse of O'Hare International Airport was packed with thousands of travelers bustling about, their faces lit up with the excitement of upcoming vacations. The constant hum of overhead announcements echoed through the terminals, updating flight schedules and gate changes. In the midst of this chaotic sea of people stood Danielle, tightly gripping the handles of two massive, heavy suitcases. Her heart was pounding. This was her very first time traveling far from home on an airplane. As a devoted wife who had always put her family first, this vacation invitation from her husband, Anthony, and her mother-in-law, Eleanor, felt like an absolute dream come true. For years of her marriage, Danielle had bent over backwards to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law. From dawn until dusk, she managed their suburban home, cooking, cleaning, and catering to their every need without a single complaint. Even though Eleanor constantly threw sharp, condescending remarks her way, mocking her for being a naive, small-town country girl from the Midwest, Danielle always swallowed the bitterness with a gentle smile and genuine grace. She firmly believed that her patience would eventually pay off, hoping that one day her mother-in-law's heart would soften. Anthony walked briskly ahead with his mother, not bothering to glance back even once to check if his wife was struggling with their ridiculously heavy luggage. Danielle quickened her pace to keep up, desperate not to ruin the happy vacation vibe she had been dreaming of all week while packing their bags. Suddenly, Eleanor stopped in her tracks and spun around, glaring at Danielle with a sharp, hostile expression. This cold treatment was a daily occurrence for Danielle, but in the middle of a crowded airport terminal, it felt deeply humiliating. "Danielle, you stay right here and watch the bags. Anthony and I are going to check in at the kiosk and grab some coffees and snacks for the flight. Don't you dare wander off. Do you understand?" Eleanor ordered, her voice dripping with venom and authority. "Yes, Eleanor. I'll watch the bags. You and Anthony go ahead and get what you need. I'll just sit on this bench right here," Danielle replied with a soft smile, taking a seat on the cold metal waiting chairs. Anthony didn't say a word to his wife. He simply turned his head with an arrogant scoff and walked away, closely shadowing his mother as they disappeared into the crowd. Time ticked by. For the first hour, Danielle remained patient, optimistically assuming the TSA security lines or the coffee shop queues were just incredibly long today. But as the second hour passed, a creeping sense of anxiety began to wrap around her heart. Her stomach growled painfully. She hadn't eaten anything since dawn, having spent the morning making sure her husband and mother-in-law had a hot breakfast before the drive to the airport. Danielle stood up, her eyes scanning the massive, echoing terminal, desperately searching for Anthony and Eleanor. But they were nowhere to be found in the endless ocean of travelers. Panicked that they might miss their flight, Danielle decided to walk a little ways down the concourse toward the food court, making sure to keep the heavy suitcases safely tucked near her bench. As she approached a large concrete pillar near the corridor leading to the final security checkpoint, she froze. Just a few yards away, partially obscured by the pillar, stood her husband and mother-in-law. A wave of relief washed over her, and she opened her mouth to call out their names. But the words died in her throat as their conversation drifted over the ambient noise of the airport. Her feet felt as if they were cemented to the cold terrazzo floor. "Just leave her there, Mom. Let's see if that stupid country girl can ever find her way home without a dime to her name." Anthony laughed. It was a loud, carefree laugh, utterly devoid of guilt. It was as if destroying his wife's life was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Exactly, Anthony. She's been nothing but a burden to our family's image. Besides, we already took her ID, her debit card, and all the cash from her purse. Let her see how miserable it is to be a homeless nobody in a strange city." "Our plan to get rid of her worked flawlessly," Eleanor chimed in, chuckling with wicked satisfaction, completely apathetic to the pure evil she had just orchestrated. Hearing those soul-crushing words, Danielle's entire world collapsed. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, her chest tightened, making it hard to breathe. and hot tears pooled in her eyes before spilling down her cheeks. She couldn't fathom that the man she had loved and served so loyally, and the woman she had treated like her own mother, possessed such demonic, calculated cruelty. Danielle clamped both hands tightly over her mouth to muffle her heartbroken sobs, terrified that these two monsters masquerading as family would hear her. Hiding behind the pillar, she watched as Anthony and Eleanor casually strolled away, flashing their boarding passes at the security checkpoint and disappearing toward the departing loon. They had loon, literator s. They never even looked back. Trembling violently, her legs barely able to support her weight, Danielle ran back to the luggage. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she unzipped her personal carry-on bag. The harsh reality slapped her across the face. The small interior pouch where she kept her driver's license, her bank cards, and her emergency cash was completely empty. They had meticulously planned this betrayal from the very beginning. Danielle realized the horrifying truth of her situation. She was stranded in a massive, unfamiliar city, completely broke, without any legal identification, and with nowhere to go. A chaotic mix of profound grief, immeasurable betrayal, and a newly sprouting, fiery anger swirled in her chest. She collapsed back onto the metal bench, burying her face in her hands, and wept silently. She ignored the confused stares of passing travelers. Her heart was shattered into a million pieces, knowing that years of absolute loyalty had been repaid with inhumane treachery. As hours passed, the frantic energy of the airport terminal began to wind down. Outside the massive glass windows, day turned to night. Security guards began side-eyeing her. Feeling exposed, Danielle grabbed her empty bag and walked aimlessly out of the automatic sliding doors into the brutal chill of the Chicago night air. The biting wind cut through her thin sweater, a cruel reflection of the misfortune she was enduring. She found a secluded, empty bench near an outdoor parking shuttle stop. Wrapping her arms tightly around herself to conserve body heat, she let her tears flow freely into the night. The sweet, patient woman had been forced to swallow the bitterest pill of all, that the world could be a ruthless place, and the people you trusted most could be the ones to destroy you. The morning sun eventually broke over the concrete horizon, waking Danielle from a fitful, freezing sleep on the hard bench. Her body ached all over, and her stomach cramped violently from hunger. All night, she had racked her brain trying to figure out why Anthony and Eleanor had done this, searching for any justification, but found nothing that could excuse such wickedness. With heavy legs and a dizzy head, she forced herself to stand. She began walking away from the airport grounds, wandering aimlessly down the busy urban sidewalks. She didn't know a single soul in this city. Her pride and sheer terror prevented her from begging pedestrians for money or food. She just kept walking, silently praying for a miracle or some guidance out of this sudden nightmare. By midday, the sun was beating down, and the city heat was sweltering. Exhausted, Danielle stopped to rest near a small, landscaped plaza at a busy downtown intersection. She sat on the concrete curb, wiping sweat from her forehead, staring blankly at the endless stream of yellow cabs and luxury cars. Suddenly, her eyes caught sight of a distinguished older man in a tailored, expensive suit walking out of a nearby high-rise. He was clutching his chest, his steps highly erratic and unbalanced. Without warning, the man collapsed hard onto the pavement. His face turned a ghastly shade of gray as he clutched his heart, his face contorted in absolute agony. A few pedestrians stopped, shocked, but they just hovered in a panicked circle, pulling out their phones but too afraid to actually step in and administer first aid. Seeing a life in danger, Danielle's innate, nurturing instinct kicked in. Forgetting her own hunger and despair, she sprinted toward the crowd, pushing her way through the onlookers, and dropped to her knees beside the gasping old man. With calm, swift movements, she loosened his expensive silk tie and unbuttoned his collar to open his airway. She pressed her fingers to his wrist. His pulse was terrifyingly weak and erratic. Pointing directly at a man in a business suit, Danielle commanded with fierce authority, "You, call 911 right now." Startled by her commanding tone, the man immediately dialed his phone. While waiting for the paramedics, Danielle firmly rubbed the man's hands and arms to stimulate circulation, gently tilting his head back to ensure his airway remained open, speaking to him in a soothing, steady voice. Her unexpected composure brought a sense of order to the chaotic street corner. Minutes later, the blare of ambulance sirens pierced the city noise. EMTs jumped out with a stretcher and emergency gear, rapidly loading the elderly man into the back. One of the paramedics looked at the crowd and asked if any family members were with him. When no one spoke up, Danielle felt a moral obligation to ensure the man she had just helped survived. She volunteered to ride in the ambulance, sitting in the corner and praying silently while the medics administered intense life-saving procedures. Upon arriving at the hospital, the man was rushed into the intensive care unit. Danielle slumped into a chair in the waiting room, her clothes rumpled and dirty, her own hopeless reality crashing back down on her. Hours of agonizing uncertainty passed until a doctor finally emerged. He walked over to Danielle, informing her that the patient had survived the massive heart attack, specifically noting that her rapid, textbook first aid response on the street had saved his life. The doctor added that the patient was awake and specifically asking to see the woman who had rescued him. Danielle followed the doctor down a quiet, heavily guarded corridor into a VIP recovery suite. It was massive, luxurious, and looked more like a five-star hotel room than a hospital. The elderly man lay weakly in the bed, but his sharp eyes were open, watching Danielle as she stepped hesitantly into the room. This was Arthur Sterling, a legendary, self-made billionaire and titan of corporate real estate. Mr. Sterling offered a faint smile at the sight of the disheveled, dusty woman whose eyes radiated nothing but pure sincerity. "Thank you, young lady. You saved my life today. The doctors told me if you hadn't acted when you did, I wouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice weak but vibrating with profound gratitude. "It's just human decency to help someone in need, sir." "I'm just so thankful you made it through and are recovering," Danielle replied politely, nodding her head, trying hard to mask the tremor of deep sorrow in her own voice. Arthur Sterling, possessing the razor-sharp instincts of a ruthless businessman, immediately recognized the heavy, crushing burden weighing on this young woman's face. He gently asked why she looked so battered, exhausted, and utterly lost. Met with such unexpected, genuine kindness, Danielle's emotional walls finally crumbled. She poured out the entire horrific story. She told him about her husband, Anthony, and his mother, Eleanor. She explained with heartbreaking clarity how they had tricked her, stripped her of her identification and money, and abandoned her at the airport like actual garbage, intentionally leaving her to rot in a city where she knew no one. Hearing this tragic tale, Mr. Sterling's expression morphed into one of cold, intense fury. He stared deeply into Danielle's eyes, looking for any sign of deception, but found only raw honesty and agonizing pain. He fell silent for a long moment, the gears of his brilliant mind turning. Then he adjusted himself in his hospital bed, looking at Danielle with absolute, unwavering conviction. "Danielle, the people who did this to you do not deserve a single one of your tears. Their cruelty must be met with proof that you are far stronger than they could ever comprehend. Crying over your bad luck won't change a damn thing, mister," Sterling stated firmly. Danielle looked at the billionaire in confusion, not quite understanding his angle. Mr. Sterling continued, offering her a lifeline she could never have imagined, in her wildest dreams. "I owe you my life, and Arthur Sterling always pays his debts in full. I am going to give you a home, protection, and everything you need to survive. But more than that, I am going to teach you. I will mold you into a fiercely independent, brilliant, and unbreakable woman. I will make you someone who can never be humiliated, trampled on, or discarded ever again. That is my offer. You can choose to go back to the streets and cry, or you can rise up with me, take back your dignity, and reclaim everything they stole from you in the most elegant, devastating way possible." Danielle sat frozen. She wiped the last tear from her cheek and stared straight ahead. The echoing memory of her husband and mother-in-law laughing at her misery flashed in her mind. The agonizing pain in her chest hardened into a core of pure, indestructible resolve. She refused to be the weak, gullible country girl anymore. With a steady voice and a heart full of absolute certainty, Danielle looked the billionaire in the eye. "I accept your offer, Mr. Sterling. I will learn everything you can teach me, and I am ready to prove to them that I am not trash to be thrown away." Arthur Sterling smiled a predatory, satisfied smile. In that exact second, Danielle's destiny was rewritten. Her lowest moment had opened the door to an empire. A path was paved to prepare her for the ultimate, elegant revenge against the traitors who ruined her. The flight back to their Midwestern hometown felt like a victory lap for Anthony and Eleanor. There was no longer a quiet, unassuming wife bothering them or embarrassing them with her lack of sophistication. Upon returning to their suburban home, the mother and son duo immediately began plotting their next move, completely devoid of remorse. A golden opportunity presented itself a few days later, when national news networks broadcasted a horrific tragedy. A massive, multi-alarm fire had burned down a cheap downtown motel and a historic market district in the exact city where they had abandoned Danielle. The news anchors grimly reported that several bodies recovered from the ashes were burned beyond recognition. Eleanor's wicked mind instantly sparked to life. She ordered Anthony to drive straight to the local police precinct to file a missing persons report, claiming his beloved wife had vanished during their vacation near the site of the inferno. Anthony played his role to absolute perfection. He walked into the police station looking utterly devastated. He rubbed his eyes to make them bloodshot, making his voice crack as if he had been sobbing for days. He fed the detectives a fabricated story about how his wife had gone out shopping near the downtown market when the fire suddenly broke out. Because Anthony had intentionally dumped Danielle's empty purse and ID in a dumpster a few blocks from that exact downtown area before flying home, Chicago police eventually found the charred remains of the bag during their grid search. Due to the chaotic nature of the disaster and the untraceable victims, the authorities eventually added Danielle's name to the official list of casualties who perished in the tragic blaze. An official death certificate was issued and mailed to Anthony, who received the document with a sickeningly fake sob in front of the mailman. Back at the house, Eleanor was already setting the stage for their next performance. She invited the entire neighborhood, distant relatives, and the pastor from their local church for a memorial service to mourn the passing of her beloved daughter-in-law. Their living room was packed with folding chairs and guests carrying casseroles, their faces solemn with grief. Eleanor sat in the front row, aggressively dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, even faking a fainting spell to draw maximum sympathy from the crowd. The neighbors, who had always known Danielle to be an incredibly sweet, hardworking, and faithful woman, wept openly. They couldn't believe such a pure soul had met such a horrific end. They took turns comforting Anthony, who kept his face buried in his hands, acting like a man whose world had just ended. The sick charade went off without a hitch. Not a single person suspected the demonic truth hiding behind the tears of the mother and son. Once the memorial ended and the last neighbor pulled out of the driveway, the suffocating aura of fake grief vanished instantly. The front door was deadbolted, and the heavy drapes were pulled shut. In the living room, Anthony and Eleanor sat across from each other, beaming with victorious, greedy grins. Anthony pulled the state-stamped death certificate from his suit pocket and slapped it onto the coffee table with a booming laugh. The final phase of their master plan was officially in motion. Danielle had been the only child of a very successful farming family, and she had inherited hundreds of acres of prime, highly coveted agricultural land on the edge of town, worth an absolute fortune to commercial developers. For years, Danielle had flat-out refused Anthony's demands to sell the property, insisting it was the only piece of her late parents she had left. But now, legally speaking, Danielle was dead. As her surviving spouse, Anthony believed he had full, uncontested legal rights to liquidate her entire estate. The very next morning, Anthony contacted a shady, unethical real estate lawyer he knew. Using the death certificate and sliding massive cash bribes to corrupt county clerks to fast-track the paperwork, Anthony successfully transferred the deeds of Danielle's family estate entirely into his own name. It didn't take long for the shady broker to find a massive corporate developer willing to pay tens of millions of dollars in cold, hard cash to bulldoze the farmland for a new commercial subdivision. The day the wire transfers cleared, Anthony came home carrying a heavy briefcase loaded with stacks of $100 bills, a taste of the unimaginable wealth sitting in his new offshore accounts. Finally, this fortune is ours, Mom. Look at this. Our lives are absolutely perfect now, Anthony cheered, running his hands over the crisp stacks of cash, his eyes wide with psychotic greed. I told you, Anthony. She was nothing but a dead weight on our lives. But at least her death actually served a purpose for this family's future. Now we can gut this boring house, buy that mansion in the gated community, and most importantly, you can finally put a ring on the woman who actually belongs in our social class. Eleanor sneered, greedily stroking the money with trembling fingers. Anthony immediately pulled out his brand-new iPhone and dialed his favorites list. A sickly, sweet, high-pitched woman's voice answered the call. It was Yvonne, Anthony's flashy, materialistic mistress, whom he had been seeing behind Danielle's back for over a year. Yvonne was a woman who worshipped designer labels, luxury cars, and high society, constantly demanding a lavish lifestyle. Anthony bragged about the multi-million-dollar real estate sale and told Yvonne to immediately start planning the most extravagant engagement party their town had ever seen for the following month. Yvonne squealed in delight, happily agreeing to the proposal, without a single ounce of guilt regarding the tragic death of her lover's wife. Inside the home that had once been kept warm and clean by Danielle's tireless devotion, there was nothing left but the echoing laughter of monsters celebrating her demise. They hired elite event planners, booked top-tier caterers, and prepared to flaunt their stolen millions to the world. They had no idea that the woman they thought they had turned to ash was currently forging herself into a weapon of absolute destruction. 1 month had passed since the traumatic abandonment at O'Hare. Danielle's life had flipped 180 degrees. She wasn't sleeping on park benches or crying over her cruel fate. Arthur Sterling had kept his word. The billionaire moved Danielle into his sprawling, ultra-secure mega-mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, guarded by a small army of private security. In that palatial estate, Danielle was forged in fire. From 6 a.m. until midnight, Danielle's schedule was brutal. Mr. Sterling flew in the country's top experts to tutor her. She learned corporate law, hostile takeovers, public speaking, wealth management, and the ruthless psychology of the American elite. At first, she struggled. Her rural public school education felt inadequate, but her burning white-hot desire for justice fueled her, allowing her to absorb the knowledge like a sponge at a terrifying speed. Danielle's physical transformation was equally staggering. Mr. Sterling hired elite personal stylists who discarded her plain, modest country dresses. Instead, they dressed her in razor-sharp, tailored designer power suits. Chanel, Tom Ford, Armani that radiated the intimidating aura of a CEO, while still maintaining her personal preference for elegant modesty. Her posture, which used to be submissive and hunched to avoid Eleanor's wrath, was now ramrod straight, radiating lethal confidence. Her eyes, once soft and easily manipulated, were now cold, calculating, and impossible to read. She learned how to mask her emotions completely, becoming a master of the poker face. Arthur Sterling watched her evolution with immense pride. He saw the terrifying potential inside the young woman, a brilliant, strategic mind that had been intentionally suffocated by a family that wanted her to remain a subservient maid. By the 3rd week, Mr. Sterling gave her a live test. He handed her authority to negotiate a vicious breach of contract dispute with a rival real estate conglomerate. Danielle stayed up all night, memorizing a 500-page legal dossier. The next morning, she sat at the head of the boardroom table, representing Sterling Enterprises. With ironclad arguments, deep legal knowledge, and an icy, uncompromising demeanor, Danielle utterly crushed the opposing corporate lawyers, saving Sterling's company millions. That victory proved it. Danielle was ready to face the real monsters. "You've evolved faster than I ever thought possible, Danielle. Your mind is sharper than a scalpel, ready to cut down anyone in your way," Arthur praised as they sat in his mahogany-lined study drinking espresso. "I owe it all to your patience, Mr. Sterling. You gave me my life and my future back," Danielle replied smoothly, her tone respectful but commanding. Arthur opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, stuffed with documents and high-resolution surveillance photos. He handed it to Danielle with a grim expression. Danielle opened the folder. Inside was a comprehensive report from an elite team of private investigators Mr. Sterling had deployed to her hometown. Danielle read exactly how Anthony had faked her death, bribed officials for a fake death certificate, and forged her signature to liquidate her family's generational farmland to a massive corporation. A quiet, deadly rage boiled in Danielle's chest, seeing her signature forged so casually to feed their endless greed. At the very back of the folder was a heavy, gold-embossed envelope. It was an invitation to the grand engagement gala of Anthony and Yvonne, scheduled for this coming weekend at Anthony's newly purchased, sprawling suburban mansion. Seeing Yvonne's name, all the puzzle pieces of her husband's betrayal clicked into place. There was no sadness left in Danielle's heart. There was only a meticulously calculated plan to burn their fake, stolen happiness to the ground. "Mr. Sterling, I believe my training is complete. It's time for me to go collect what is mine," Danielle said, her voice eerily calm, her eyes locked on the forged deeds. "I assumed you'd say that," Arthur smiled, leaning back. "My corporate legal team has already prepared the grand larceny, fraud, and identity theft indictments. Furthermore, I used a shell corporation to quietly buy back the commercial rights to your family's farmland from the developers. Legally, Danielle, you are still the sole, rightful owner of every single asset they are currently celebrating with. Danielle stood up, smoothing the jacket of her designer suit. She caught her reflection in the antique mirror across the study. The weak, naive, people-pleasing country girl had died on the freezing concrete outside that airport. The woman staring back at her was a titan who would never let anyone disrespect her again. The trap was fully set. Danielle coordinated her arrival with Sterling's legal team and a specialized task force from the FBI and local authorities. Judgment Day was here, and Danielle was going to make sure their total destruction was broadcast live to every single elitist snob they had invited to their stolen party. The ultimate payback for playing games with her life was about to begin. That Saturday night, the sprawling new mega mansion Anthony had bought with Danielle's money was practically glowing with obnoxious wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers imported directly from Europe illuminated the grand foyer, reflecting off the freshly polished marble floors. Tens of thousands of dollars worth of rare, exotic floral arrangements choked the hallways, filling the air with a heavy, intoxicating perfume. A professional string quartet played Mozart softly in the corner, adding to the sickeningly pretentious atmosphere. Long banquet tables draped in imported silk were loaded with beluga caviar, lobster tails, and Wagyu beef, prepared by a celebrity chef hired specifically to impress the local country club elite. Every inch of the property was an aggressive display of new money, a desperate attempt to prove they were untouchable. Anthony stood in the center of the grand ballroom, his chest puffed out like a peacock. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than what a normal family made in 6 months. Clinging to his arm was Yvonne, his mistress-turned-fiancée. She was flashing a smug, arrogant smile, dripping in diamond necklaces, earrings, and a massive engagement ring. Yvonne couldn't stop staring at her own reflection in the mirrored walls, convinced she was the queen of the world. She didn't care for a second that her diamonds were bought with the blood money of a discarded wife. To Yvonne, cash was king, and Anthony was her personal ATM. The guests, mostly local politicians, shady real estate brokers, and Yvonne's shallow socialite friends mingled, sipping vintage champagne and offering endless congratulations. In another corner, Eleanor was holding court with the snobby neighborhood housewives she had always desperately wanted to impress. She was practically suffocating under layers of thick gold jewelry, gesturing wildly to show it all off. Speaking loudly so everyone could hear, Eleanor spun a pathetic, fake sob story about the tragic motel fire, but quickly pivoted, declaring that the tragedy had paved the way for Yvonne, a woman who was classy, wealthy, and actually on our level. Congratulations, Anthony. You finally found a woman who actually fits the high-status pedigree of our family, Eleanor cheered loudly, intentionally drawing the crowd's attention as she strutted over to the happy couple. Absolutely, Mom. The dark times are buried in the past, Anthony laughed, raising his crystal champagne flute. Now it's time to enjoy the fruits of our labor and build an empire. Yvonne giggled her fake, breathy laugh. She waved her diamond-covered hand to summon a waiter carrying a tray of drinks. When the young server accidentally tilted the tray slightly, Yvonne unleashed a vicious, humiliating verbal assault on the terrified kid, screaming at him in front of the entire party for being incompetent trash. The poor waiter apologized profusely, backing away in fear. Anthony and Eleanor just chuckled, fully believing their wealth gave them the divine right to abuse the working class. The guests fell silent, exchanging awkward glances, but no one dared speak up against the millionaire host. As the party reached its peak, Anthony strutted confidently up to a small, elevated stage set up for the toasts. He tapped the microphone, and the string quartet immediately stopped playing. The ballroom fell dead silent. Hundreds of eyes locked onto Anthony. Flashing a $1,000,000 smile, Anthony launched into a sickeningly pompous speech. He bragged endlessly about his real estate empire, his brilliant business acumen, and how incredibly blessed he was to find his soulmate, Yvonne, after enduring such a harrowing, traumatizing year. He spun his lies with the charisma of a psychopath, making the clueless guests tear up at his fake resilience. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, Anthony projected into the mic. This isn't just an engagement party. This is a celebration of a family rising from the ashes of a terrible tragedy. We lost a piece of this family to a horrific fire in Chicago. But God is just. He rewarded our suffering with unimaginable success and brought this beautiful angel into my life. The room erupted into thundering applause. Yvonne blushed and blew him a kiss. Eleanor wiped away a totally fake tear with a silk napkin, playing the role of the grieving but proud mother to perfection. In her twisted mind, abandoning Danielle was the smartest business move she had ever made. But right as the applause peaked, a strange commotion erupted from the front gates of the estate. The heavy roar of multiple high-powered engines echoed up the sweeping driveway. Guests near the floor-to-ceiling windows gasped, pressing their faces to the glass. Outside, a convoy of black, unmarked SUVs and several flashing police cruisers had aggressively blocked the front gates. Anthony's private security guards were running around in absolute panic, shouting into their earpieces as heavily armed police officers and men in federal windbreakers swarmed the manicured lawns. Up on stage, Anthony frowned, annoyed that his big moment was being interrupted. He assumed it was just a noise complaint. He aggressively snapped his fingers at his personal assistant, gesturing for him to go deal with the cops. But just as the assistant reached the massive, solid oak double doors of the ballroom, they were kicked violently open from the outside. Bang! The heavy doors slammed against the walls with a deafening crack. Several women in the crowd shrieked. The champagne-fueled joy of the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, icy tension. The cold night wind howled into the warm ballroom, a literal manifestation of the storm that was about to hit. Every single pair of eyes in the room snapped toward the entrance. Out of the darkness, a squad of uniformed police officers and plainclothes detectives marched into the ballroom with military precision. They immediately fanned out, locking down every single exit, standing with their hands resting near their duty belts. The socialites began whispering in sheer panic, backing away in terror. Anthony stood frozen on the stage. His heart slammed against his ribs. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He desperately tried to convince himself this was a mistake about a building permit. Eleanor, furious that her perfect night was being ruined, marched forward, her face red with rage. She was ready to use her new money to scream at the police chief and have these officers fired. But before she could utter a single insult, her feet stopped dead. The sharp, rhythmic click-clack of stiletto heels echoed against the marble floor from the entryway. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and terrifying, like the pounding gavel of a judge about to hand down a death sentence. Parting the sea of federal agents, a woman stepped into the light of the crystal chandeliers. She possessed an aura of such overwhelming, intimidating power that it sucked the oxygen out of the room. She was dressed in a breathtaking, custom-tailored dark designer suit that screamed executive power, paired with an elegant, perfectly styled silk scarf draped gracefully around her neck. She wore large, dark designer sunglasses that obscured her face. Her posture was flawless. There was no trace of the mousy, submissive housewife left. She looked like a billionaire CEO arriving to execute a hostile takeover. Absolute, pin-drop silence fell over the ballroom. Nobody dared to breathe. With a slow, agonizingly elegant motion, the woman raised her hand and pulled the dark sunglasses off her face. The face that Anthony and Eleanor had officially buried in a casket 1 month ago was now illuminated under the bright lights. It was Danielle. Her jaw was set in stone, but her lips curled into a chilling, lethal smile. She stared dead at Anthony, who was standing on the stage like a paralyzed deer. Danielle! Eleanor shrieked. Her voice cracked into a hoarse, demonic screech that shattered the silence. Her eyes bulged so wide, they looked like they would pop out of her skull. Her elderly body began convulsing with violent tremors. She pointed a shaking, jewel-covered finger at the door. Her brain short-circuited. She truly believed her daughter-in-law had been incinerated. The only logical explanation in Eleanor's warped mind was that this was a vengeful ghost, a demon crawling out of the ashes to drag her to hell. "No, you're dead! Get out of here! Don't you haunt my family!" Eleanor screamed at the top of her lungs, stumbling backward in a blind panic, until she crashed into a catering table, sending hundreds of dollars of crystal glasses shattering to the floor. On stage, Anthony's knees gave out. The microphone slipped from his sweaty fingers, hitting the floor with an excruciatingly loud electronic screech. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but his vocal cords were paralyzed. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a literal corpse. His brain fired in a million different directions. If Danielle was alive, if she was standing right here, flanked by the FBI and police, that meant the death certificate was fraudulent. That meant the sale of the multi-million-dollar estate was completely illegal. And that meant the mansion, the cars, the jewelry, and the cash he was flaunting were all the result of massive, federal-level wire fraud and grand larceny. The horrifying reality of decades in federal prison slammed into him like a freight train. Yvonne, totally oblivious to the actual history of Anthony's dead wife, stared wildly between Anthony and Danielle. She violently yanked on Anthony's tuxedo sleeve. "Anthony, who the hell is this? Why is your mother screaming like a psychopath?" she demanded shrilly. But Anthony didn't even blink. He was locked in a staring contest with the Grim Reaper herself. Danielle stopped dead center in the ballroom, surrounded by the terrified high society guests. She offered the coldest, most terrifying smile anyone in that room had ever witnessed. "What's wrong, Anthony? Eleanor? Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Danielle's voice was smooth, calm, and perfectly modulated, yet it cut through the room like a razor blade. "At the airport, you laughed and said you wanted to see if the stupid country girl could find her way home. Well, take a good look. The stupid country girl you threw away found her way back." Hearing her actual voice, seeing the rise and fall of her chest, Eleanor finally realized the horrific truth. This wasn't a ghost. Danielle was alive. She had survived. And she had come back with money and power that Eleanor couldn't even fathom. The realization that she was going to lose her wealth, be humiliated in front of her country club friends, and die in a concrete prison cell caused Eleanor's blood pressure to spike to lethal levels. Her chest seized. The room spun violently. With a final, pathetic gasp, Eleanor's eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed entirely, her body hitting the marble floor face first in a pile of broken glass. She was out cold. A second later, the sheer, crushing weight of the impending federal indictments broke Anthony. His eyes rolled back. His legs folded beneath him, and he plummeted off the edge of the small stage, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. He fainted dead away, joining his mother in unconsciousness. The engagement party, a monument to their greed, had transformed into an execution chamber, and Danielle hadn't even had to lift a single finger to destroy them. Total chaos erupted in the ballroom. Guests shrieked, backing away from the unconscious mother and son. A few people rushed forward to help, but the lead detective barked a booming order to step back and not touch the suspects. Danielle stood unbothered, letting the panic simmer. Watching the people who had destroyed her life lying unconscious at her feet was the ultimate closure. Slowly, Danielle turned to face the hundreds of wealthy guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for interrupting your caviar," Danielle announced, her voice booming with total authority, requiring no microphone to command the massive room. "But there is a truth you all need to hear tonight." The crowd held its collective breath. Danielle signaled to a detective, who handed her a thick legal binder. She opened it smoothly. "My name is Danielle. I am the legal living wife of the man currently passed out on the floor. 1 month ago, he and his mother took me on a vacation, stole my ID, drained my bank cards, and abandoned me at O'Hare Airport to die on the streets. They wanted to erase me from their lives." Gasps of horror rippled through the socialites. The heroic widower they had been praising all night was actually a monster. Danielle pulled a state-stamped document from the binder, holding it up high. But their depravity didn't stop there. When a tragic fire broke out in Chicago, my husband filed a false police report claiming I burned to death. This is the fraudulent death certificate he bribed officials to procure. The crowd erupted in disgusted whispers. The admiration they had for Anthony morphed into pure, visceral revulsion. Danielle pulled out a stack of real estate deeds. And the motive? Pure, unadulterated greed. Using my fake death, he forged my signature and illegally liquidated my family's generational farmland. Every single thing you see tonight, the food you are eating, the crystal chandeliers, the diamond ring on his mistress's finger was paid for with stolen money. You are drinking champagne funded by grand larceny. The room exploded. The wealthy elite, horrified that they were complicit in a massive crime scene, began throwing their champagne flutes onto the floor in disgust, shouting profanities at the unconscious hosts. Amidst the uproar, Anthony groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. His head throbbed from hitting the floor. As his vision cleared, the first thing he saw was Danielle towering over him like an avenging angel, while his business partners screamed insults at him. He tried to sit up, but he was too weak. Eleanor also began to stir. She opened her eyes to find the country club wives she had tried so hard to impress, staring down at her with absolute disgust. Eleanor tried to crawl backward, trembling, realizing there was no escape. She looked at the police, then at the federal indictments in Danielle's hands. It was over. The lead detective marched forward, grabbing Anthony by the collar and dragging him to his feet. He loudly read Anthony his Miranda rights. "Anthony, you are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, perjury, and conspiracy to commit fraud," the detective listed, violently yanking Anthony's arms behind his back. The loud clack of the steel handcuffs echoing through the ballroom was the final nail in the coffin of his fake empire. Anthony didn't fight back. His spirit was completely broken. Two female officers yanked Eleanor up by her arms. The old woman kicked and thrashed, crying hysterically, begging her rich neighbors for help. But everyone just turned their backs in disgust. Eleanor was cuffed and shoved toward her son, standing side by side in handcuffs in front of everyone they wanted to impress. The sheer terror of prison finally shattered the bond between mother and son. Desperate to save themselves, their true, selfish natures erupted. "This is all your fault, Mom," Anthony suddenly screamed, his face red with veins popping. "If you hadn't brainwashed me into leaving her at the airport, we wouldn't be going to federal prison. You told me she was in the way. This was all your psychotic idea." Eleanor shrieked back, spitting with venom. "You ingrate! Don't you dare put this on me. Who went to the precinct and fake cried to get the death certificate? You did. Who forged her signature so you could sleep with that trashy gold digger? You did. You're a greedy, stupid little boy." The crowd watched in morbid fascination as the mother and son viciously tore each other apart, publicly confessing to their crimes in front of the detectives, who were gladly recording the entire meltdown for the prosecutors. Suddenly, Yvonne realized she was standing in the middle of a federal crime scene. The gold digger realized her billionaire fiancé was actually a broke felon heading to a maximum security prison. Revolted, Yvonne violently ripped the diamond engagement ring off her finger, unclasped the diamond necklace, and hurled the jewelry directly at Anthony's face. "You broke, lying piece of trash!" Yvonne shrieked. "You think I'd marry a convict? We are done." Yvonne hiked up her expensive gown and made a dead sprint for the front doors to escape. But two massive police officers stepped in her path, blocking the exit. "Excuse me, ma'am, you're not going anywhere," the officer said sternly. "Federal records show millions of dollars of stolen funds were transferred into your personal accounts. You're coming downtown for questioning regarding money laundering and receiving stolen property." Yvonne's face went chalk white. Her legs gave out, and she began wailing and sobbing, screaming that she didn't know anything, blaming Anthony for tricking her. But the cops didn't care. They slapped cuffs on her, too. In the blink of an eye, the three people who thought they owned the world were reduced to weeping, pathetic criminals. Danielle stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with a blank expression, though her soul felt lighter than it had in years. She didn't need to scream or curse at them. Karma had done the heavy lifting, tearing them apart from the inside out. The officers shoved Anthony, Eleanor, and Yvonne out the front doors and packed them into the back of the police cruisers. As the red and blue lights faded down the driveway, the reign of their fake empire officially ended. The months that followed were a living nightmare for Anthony and Eleanor. Housed in county lockup while awaiting federal trial, their lives of luxury were replaced by the brutal reality of the justice system. Their soft beds were swapped for thin mats on concrete floors. Their gourmet meals became lukewarm cafeteria slop. With Arthur Sterling's elite legal team working alongside federal prosecutors, the trial was swift and merciless. The forged deeds were voided, and every single cent, including the mansion and cars, was seized by the government and returned to Danielle. To make matters infinitely worse for Anthony, during the FBI raid on his mansion, agents found a massive brick of cocaine hidden in his home office safe. It turned out that the shady real estate lawyer he had scammed out of a commission had planted the drugs in his house as payback. This triggered mandatory minimum drug trafficking charges. On the day of the sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Anthony and Eleanor were dragged in wearing orange jumpsuits, chained at the wrists and ankles. They looked sickly, aged, and hollowed out. Danielle sat in the front row, flanked by Mr. Sterling and her lawyers. She wore a pristine, cream-colored tailored suit, radiating absolute serenity and power. Before the judge read the sentence, Anthony and Eleanor broke down. They collapsed to their knees in the middle of the courtroom, crawling toward the wooden partition separating them from the gallery. They openly wept, begging Danielle for mercy. "Danielle, please. I'm so sorry. I was blinded by the money. Please ask the judge for leniency. I can't survive in there. Anthony sobbed. His head bowed in utter humiliation. Eleanor gripped the wooden railing, weeping hysterically. Danielle, my sweet girl. I'm an evil old woman. Have mercy on me. I'll die in that cold cell. I'm begging you. Danielle didn't flinch. She looked down at them with eyes as cold as ice. The memory of them leaving her to starve in Chicago flashed through her mind. The woman you abandoned to die is gone, Danielle said, her voice echoing clearly through the silent courtroom. You are only crying because you got caught. I forgive you, for the sake of my own peace. But the law does not forgive grand larceny. You will pay for exactly what you did. The gavel slammed down. Anthony was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early parole. Eleanor was given 15 years. The heavy steel doors of the penitentiary slammed shut on their lives forever. 1 year later, Danielle was no longer known as the victimized wife from a small town. She was a titan of industry. Under Arthur Sterling's continued mentorship, she had taken the recovered millions from her family's land and built a massive, ethical real estate and investment firm. She constructed affordable housing, created hundreds of jobs, and became a highly respected CEO in the Chicago corporate world. But wealth hadn't corrupted her soul. Danielle funneled her massive profits into a foundation dedicated to helping stranded, abused, and homeless women. She built shelters, provided free legal aid, and funded food banks across the Midwest. Her philanthropy made her a beloved figure, proving that true wealth was measured by how many people you could pull up from the bottom. Meanwhile, inside the maximum security penitentiary, Anthony spent his days scrubbing prison toilets, his hair falling out from extreme stress, bullied by inmates who despised white-collar criminals. In the women's facility, Eleanor was a miserable outcast, forced to do the laundry for the toughest gangs in her cell block, weeping every night on her thin mattress for the luxury she threw away. On a bright Tuesday morning, Danielle stood in her corner office on the 50th floor of a downtown Chicago skyscraper, looking out over the city that had once almost broken her. The heavy glass doors opened, and Arthur Sterling walked in, leaning slightly on a cane but smiling warmly. You've proven that integrity and intelligence can slaughter the greatest of evils, Danielle. I couldn't be prouder of the empire you've built, mister, Sterling said, taking a seat on the leather sofa. Danielle turned from the window, a genuine, radiant smile on her face. I owe it to the man who gave me a second chance on the street that day, she replied softly. I promise to keep using this power to protect those who can't protect themselves. The storm was finally over. The greedy had been buried by their own ambition, while the girl they discarded had built a fortress of success that no one could ever tear down.